The GPS is an amazing piece of technology. We have become so used to it, though, that we hardly think about its awe and wonder anymore. But for the last couple of years, I've been fascinated by something that I believe is even more powerful. I believe that as humans, we have the equivalent of a GPS embedded in ourselves, and that we use it every day without even knowing about its existence. I call it a personal guidance system, or PGS. And I describe that in my book, Live and Lead, and How One Can Develop Your Own. In short, it consists of three core elements, namely purpose, which is our PGS destination, our values. In the PGS, they are the satellites, and our behavior, the things we need to do in order to get our destination, similar to driving a vehicle. I also argue in my book that a meaningful and happy life is indeed possible when the core elements of our PGS is connected first of all, and secondly, in synchronization with each other. I also point out that our personal PGSs are forged by influences around us, like the families we are born in or that we marry into. They each have their own GPS, and indeed each society has a guidance system. And in order to function well as an individual in society, we need to ensure that our personal GPS is aligned with those spheres of influence. But back to the real life GPS. When do you need it most? Of course, when you travel to unknown places, when you leave the familiar. A prerequisite, though, is that our GPS should have the relevant maps in its memory. Otherwise, it will be of no use. So that's why we normally make sure, prior to traveling, that the relevant maps are available in the memory of our GPS, and if not, we have to upload them prior to our trip. Talking about strange places. Say for a moment that I'm a true born and bred Englishman, and I am visiting, say, China. Now, if I address someone with the words "not bad" as a way of acknowledging what that person did, how would a born and bred Chinese person react? How would they perceive what I've just said? Truth, he said, to most non-Brits, it may be interpreted as poor or mediocre, where of course I really meant good or very good, old chap. Thus, it's possible that I could just achieve the opposite from what I actually had in mind. This is what is often described as culture shock. This happens when I make assumptions about the world from my way of looking at it. Or using the analogy with the GPS, I had the wrong maps loaded in my GPS. Now, this is all okay for a real-world GPS, the device that we know, but what would be the equivalent for the PGS, the personal guidance system that I've been discussing? Well, luckily, a gentleman by the name of Professor Geert Hofstede came up with some useful answers. First of all, he provided us with a very useful definition of culture, which he describes as being the collective programming of our minds by which one group differentiates itself from another. Or in PGS speak, it is the shaping of our PGS via the guidance systems into which we have embedded ourselves. Remember, we sit in the middle with our own personal GPS, and then on the outer rings we have family, society, company, and so forth. But Prof. Hofstede contributed something much more useful. He came up with a very simple but very effective model by which we can actually distinguish between the cultures of different nations. It is now known as the Hofstede model for the dimensions of national cultures, and they are the following: power distance, individualism, masculinity, uncertainty avoidance, and long-term orientation. He also developed a scale by which each country score can be measured. Let's look at power distance, which is defined as the extent to which the less powerful members of society accept that power is distributed unequally. Scoring high on this means that we have a need for hierarchy in a society and that we actually willingly give power holders power and privileges. Scoring low on this means that we prefer that everybody should have equal rights and that our superiors should be highly accessible. Individualism refers to the way that we define ourselves in society. Scoring high on this means that there is a high I consciousness in society, and we are focused at fulfilling obligations to ourselves. Scoring low means that we've got a we consciousness, and we prefer collectivism. In other words, we associate with the families, the clans, in the organizations that we actually associate with. Masculinity refers to the dominant values that prevail in society. Scoring high on this means that values like success and achievement is really important in that society. Big and fast are beautiful. Scoring low on this means that the dominant value in that society are caring for others and quality of life, and we rather think of work as something we need to do in order to be able to live. Uncertainty avoidance refers to the extent to which people feel threatened by uncertainty and ambiguity and try to avoid such situations. So scoring high on this means we have a high need for laws and rules, and we want to avoid failure, and we want clear agreements. Whereas scoring low on this means that we are flexible, we have less need for rules, and we are less stressy. Long-term orientation refers to the way society looks into the future. Are we pragmatic and future-orientated with a long-time perspective, or are we of a short-term nature, and do we look at results in the short term? So scoring high on this means that we are pragmatic and we believe in perseverance and we accept change more easily. Scoring low on this means we have a high need for stability, we would like to have quick results, and we are typically more normative in our thinking. Now let's quickly revisit the Brit that goes to China. And let's score according to the Hofstede measurements, how we would score in each of those dimensions. They are then 35, 89, 66, 35, and 25. In contrast with this, a typical Chinese person would score quite differently on some aspects, and let's have a look at that. So for power distance, 80. Individualism 20, masculinity 66, and uncertainty avoidance 30, and long-term orientation 118. So isn't this fascinating? Look at those scores that differentiate quite a bit between the two nations. It's on power distance, individualism, and long-term orientation. And I think you can see why people will react or view each other quite differently if they come from these different paradigms. And back to our PGS and the equivalent of maps in it. So the equivalent then, to summarize, would be to understand these dimensions of Hofstede and also understand the different scores and being able actually to connect those to real life situations. If we travel to a country with those loaded in our minds, and with a thorough knowledge of the differences and what they mean in the way we speak, the way we negotiate, etc., we are ready to travel in that country. Thus, our PGS, or personal GPS, is empowered and sensitive to culture. So what next? Well, I propose that you do two things at least. First of all, you go and check the health of your PGS in general. There's a fascinating piece of software that will help you to analyze that, and you'll get a fancy report like this with lots of insights. And secondly, that you go and check how culturally ready you are by doing another brief online profile, which will also provide you with a very useful little report. If you still want more information, here is another website reference to you, and you can of course also go to the Brainworks website, www.brainworks.co.za. I hope you enjoyed the journey and that you will make sure that your PJS will be culturally aware before you travel again.